We're talking about Lumen. We are talking about Lumen today. Lumen 2.0. That's the theme of the sort of the design streams that we've been doing lately. Lumen 2 Electric Boogaloo. That's right. That's us. That's what we're doing right now. So this is the third part of a series of streams that I'm doing on what is Lumen 2.0. I don't know if this is the last part, if we're only halfway. I have no concept. These streams are not ultimately designed, the goal is not to ultimately write Lumen entirely here on the stream. I don't do most of my actual writing on stream. It's to get the high concepts, right? We have these high concepts and then flesh them out a little bit. We are now sitting at a lot of combat, or a lot of concepts. And we left off with this idea of enemies in combat. That's the last thing that we were going to talk about last time. So that's where we're picking up. Like I said, this is part 3. So if you're watching this and you haven't seen the other parts, you should check them out. They also kind of provide some context for why things are going to be talked about the way that they are today. I'm excited about today and talking about it because this is the thing that we're going to talk about today is probably one of the biggest departures from how Lumen works. I'm going to write myself one more note here before we go into it. So we've spent time talking about characters, what a character is. We've talked about combat. Those are, the big pillars of Lumen is combat. But really, we've only talked about combat in terms of, is it a grid or a theater of the mind thing? What about drops and turn order and stuff like that? But we haven't really talked about, pardon me, what an enemy looks like or what fighting an enemy looks like. And so let's talk about that. In order to understand how it works, we need to kind of consider how previous Lumen games have worked in terms of enemy design and stuff like that. So I've been playing a very small Nova campaign lately, and I've been having a lot of fun with it. And I am finding that it's very combat focused. That makes sense. It's Nova, it's Lumen, that's what it's all about. But I'm kind of largely ignoring everything that's in the book right now about how enemies work. And I've also noticed that I have done that with other games that are Lumen games as well. Such as I've played Light with a bunch of people, and I kind of just would make it up as I would go. And when I don't do that, it's games like Hunt. Hunt has kind of a very explicit role that the enemy plays when you fight them, because there's only the one. There's just the beast that you fight at the end. And then a non-Lumen game like Slayers. Slayers, I follow the rules. I follow how the enemies are designed to be used and everything. And if you're familiar with all of those games, what you'll know is that in the latter games, Hunt and Slayers and things like that, enemies are explicit in what they do. They have specific actions that they can take, that the GM chooses from on when it's that enemy's turn, and they do those things. And that's not how it works in Lumen. At least that's not how it's kind of core written. So, let's pull up Lumen here just to have it as a point of comparison, right? Let's go to enemies here. Enemies in Lumen 1.0 have health, they have harm, and then they have moves. Moves are, as you can see here, actions, reactions, tactics. They're also oftentimes just narrative things. Like loyal foot soldiers, 2 health, 1 harm. They do it at these ranges. And then their moves are duck behind cover for a moment, summon an arcane turret, obey commands. These are interesting, like, ideas for how this character generally behaves, but they are not hard and fast actions by any means. And when one of the most common things people bring up when they're like, "Hey, I don't really understand how to use the enemies in Nova." I understand their confusion because they don't, you look at something like this, duck behind cover for a moment, but then do they do harm? And then when do they do harm? None of these necessarily do harm. It's not obvious. It's not clear. I wrote it that way initially because I like having that freedom of just to kind of make up what an enemy does in a fight. And I think that works for some scenarios, and then it just kind of really struggles in others. And I think it struggles in Nova because the players have very explicit buttons, essentially, that they're pushing. They have their powers, and it's just which one are they doing? And it tells you exactly what happens when you use that power. But the enemies don't. There's no parity between how a GM does things and how the players do things. Right now, in Lumen, there is no parity. Meaning they don't match. They're not the same as one another, right? They behave differently between how PCs act and enemies act by the GM. They're very different. And I want to change that. I want to make the enemies more explicit. Enemies need much more explicit actions that they can take. Look at Slayers. So if we look at Slayers, enemies have passives, or I don't even know if I call them passives. It's been a while since I've looked at Slayers. I think I have a copy right here. I do. Okay. What word did I use? I did use the word passive. I think I used to call them ongoing, which is what was in my head. So they have passives, they have actions, and they have reactions. All right, they have passives, actions, reactions. I don't think we necessarily need all of these, but it's nice to have these sort of categories. And an enemy in Lumen should have some combination of these things. And they're not, these shouldn't be open to interpretation, unsure how they manifest, and not linked to things like harm if it's an attack. So that's another big confusion, is that in Nova, all the enemies have a health and then they have a harm, but then they have a bunch of moves that are not attacks. And so the question is, do they deal harm with these moves? It doesn't really make sense. Especially since some of the moves are like explicitly bad for the enemy, like running away because they're cowardly. They shouldn't deal harm in that situation. But it would make sense that a GM might be confused about that. So providing a much more explicit list, I think, is just the obvious choice. I also think remove the generic amount of harm they deal. Instead, link harm, if they deal it, to specific actions. That just makes sense, right? It just makes sense to do that. To then allow a person to read the actions of the enemies and go, okay, this is an action that is going to deal harm. This is an action that's not going to deal harm. Also note that harm is... Well, I've gone back and forth on this since we last talked with one another. Harm is one of two things. It affects health or approaches. We talked about this before, just to kind of return to it. a character, how I am primarily seeing Lumen 2.0 games being written is that health is removed. That PCs no longer have a health stat. But instead they have their approaches, and that when they take anything that would be normally harm that would subtract health, they are instead losing these approaches. The maximum value of an approach gets knocked down. This then makes taking damage meaningful, because your approaches are also how you're able to do other things outside of combat. And if that stuff gets knocked down, then yeah, it makes sense that you got beat up in a fight and now you're not as able to do your adventuring on the other side of the fight. But in like a normal game or a traditional game, right? You look at something like D&D, you got 90 hit points and you lose 30 of them in a fight, it literally doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all, right? It doesn't affect you in any way, shape, or form. The only hit point that matters is 1, right? Because that's you 1 away from death. And if you lose 30 hit points and you start adventuring right after that fight, your ability to adventure has not been affected whatsoever. I don't want to do that. I want the fights to be more meaningful. Which is, you know, I think that's an interesting conversation, because it is a departure, in a sense, from one of the kind of the core concepts of Lumen, which is that it is, at least in theory, a system designed for power fantasy. But I'm starting to think, I don't think Lumen 2.0 is necessarily that. I think it can be, but I don't think it's as supportive of the concept of power fantasy as Lumen 1. Okay, this is the easy thing to talk about, the codifying the actions, right? We give codified actions to enemies. It makes sense. It saves us a whole bunch of headaches and stuff like that about, hey, how am I supposed to actually interpret these moves? I think you can still provide moves and stuff like that, but they're just not explicitly like a thing that the enemy chooses. It's just ways that the enemy might act in a fight that the GM can call upon or use as like a, oh, cool, I know that generally speaking these people do this sort of stuff. The big thing that I want to talk about today is, what about the health of an enemy? Because if we're removing health from PCs, do we also then want to remove health from enemies? To again create that parity, right? To create that link, that commonality between the player experience and the GM experience. If we were to do that, right? If we were to remove health from enemies, BLG is here. That's great news. Very good to see you, Brandon. You got here just in time for like the theoretically interesting part of the discussion. All right, so all right, you're very excited. Your copy of Reap has arrived. That's awesome. Okay, so traditionally in my games and in a lot of other games, enemies have had health, right? They usually have less than PCs. They usually die from, like, especially in Nova, like 1 or 2 hits. So, like, the difference between an enemy having 3 health and 4 health in Nova oftentimes really doesn't matter. Because the sparks are dealing so much harm anyway that an enemy essentially dies in 1 or 2 hits. With very few exceptions, in pretty much all the Lumen games, you're going to die in 1 or 2 hits. So really, what are we gaining by having health, right? What do we gain by having a specific number for health if most enemies die in 1 or 2 hits? right? Are we only including health to account for when we have bigger enemies, like elites and bosses and things like that, who we don't want to die in 1 or 2 hits, and so we give them more health just so that they survive? Right? Then I mean that's kind of largely why health exists. What is my dog doing? Keep an eye on her. So if that's largely why health exists in fights and stuff like that, then let's think about what we can do that is not that. That is something different. That is an opportunity to kind of think about fighting and health and enemies in a different way, which is, I'll get back to this tags thing in a second. Why not just kill enemies in 1 hit or 2 hits always? Or pretty much always. Why not just have that be the case, right? Why not... Oh, my music has stopped. Let me figure out what's going on. Why not just, like, let the enemies just get nuked? They already get nuked in Lumen, so why not just kind of make that more explicit? That's what I want to do. Yeah, once you flip them on the shell, you just give them a little squish and they're dead. I played with this idea in Dusk. In Dusk, which is it's a Lumen 2.0 game. It's very rules light. All enemies die in 1 hit. Every enemy that the shards attack will die in 1 hit. But combat is still dangerous because you're not immortal like the sparks, and you need to be smart about how you engage with it. But like, enemies die in 1 hit. And if they don't die in 1 hit, there's basically a list of defensive tags that I created that could make it so that you might need to do 2 hits, or a very specific 1 hit is the thing that kills the enemy. Fights where enemies have hit points are just so slow to me, right? They're just very unbelievably slow. If an enemy has 10 hit points, right, and our characters are on average dealing out 3 harm, let's say, it's going to take 4 people to cross that thing. So that's either one person hitting the same enemy 4 times, or all of us having to gang up on this one thing. And it's just not particularly fun, right? And we've already removed health from the players so that every impact matters. Why not just do the same thing for the enemies? Enemies in Lumen 2.0 die in 1 hit. They die in 1 hit. Here, let me line it up. Here are the possible ways an enemy dies in Lumen 2.0. And then we'll talk about what all these things. 1 hit. Most enemies. 2 hits. Bigger, slightly elite enemies. 1 specific hit. Specialty enemies. A bunch of... I don't know, let's just call it like mini objectives. Bosses. Alright, how does this work? Well, enemies don't have health, so that means PCs don't need harm. That's a huge thing that buys us, right? We no longer need to design powers and weapons and things like that give a specific amount of harm. Like, again, let's pull up Nova here. Here's a thing for Pyre, right? Pyre, when you use the finisher, you streak around dealing 1 harm to every injured enemy, right? It's an explicit number. Or deal 2 harm to an enemy at close, or 3 harm if you move before. Great. Those are specific numbers. Let's just remove that, right? Let's just let you have a thing, an action that you do that maybe lets you target enemies in a particular way. but the harm is pretty much always going to be a lethal amount of harm. These are all dependent on defensive tags. I don't know if this is ultimately the word or phrasing that I'm going to use for it, but this is a thing that I played around with in Dusk, which is the idea that your character or the enemies can have specific tags on them that mean that they have to be hit in a particular way. I'm jumping to this thing just because it will make more... Actually, let me switch these. It'll make more sense to kind of explain these when I kind of talk about tags. All right, so defensive tags. These are words that describe a reason the enemy is harder to kill. Right? Not really used by mobs or by a very specific type of mob. Let's use some examples to explain this. Armored. Armored is a really explicit one because it's armored is just this enemy. This enemy is highly armored. Needs to be pierced in order to be killed. Right? It needs to be pierced in order to be killed. Great. What does that mean? Well, there could then be offensive tags, right? That counter these things. Right? So if you have a weapon or power that has pierce, you kill armor tagged enemies in one hit. Boom, done. Donkey Kong Country Style, right? DK can take out big enemies. Diddy has cartwheel to do it, right? Exactly. So if an enemy has armored, you have to pierce it. It also allows the players to do stuff in their fights that is not just explicitly only their weapons and everything, because they can look to other things to, like, maneuvers, right? They can use their approaches to find ways to, like, strip the armor off or something like that, right? Another... Let me just see if I have Dusk. Like, I'll pull up Dusk just so that I can show you the, like, very explicitly what it looks like. Let's open this. Hold. Infinity's taking its time. All right. Right, so here are some enemy tags, right? An enemy might be arcane, and if they are arcane, you need to destroy some sort of ritual or runes or something like that in order for that enemy to be made vulnerable so that you can kill them. Or an enemy is armored, requires a powerful hit. What is a powerful hit? You all get it as a table to decide that. Elite enemies, they require more than one hit, right? This is the people that you need to hit twice. How you hit them twice is either way, it's fine, whatever, but you have to hit them more than once. Notice then that there's massive, requires more than one hit. That's kind of the same thing. Enemies can have multiple tags. So if you give an enemy elite and massive, you know you gotta hit them like 3 times in order to kill them. Ah, cool, awesome. You wouldn't use a lot of those over and over again, the ones that like require to be hit more than once, just because, again, then you're effectively just making hit points. But the more interesting thing is to try and come up with the tags, right? So an enemy that is quick has to be stunned or slowed or hit with something that is faster than them, right? This is what I want fighting to be like. I want it to be a puzzle. This allows you to have a puzzle, right? So Corvus Raven has stealth and flying, which means they have to be removed, and flying means they cannot be hit by melee weapons. But if you hit them in one, right, if you've revealed them, like you have a power that reveals nearby invisible things, or you do something that reveals them, then you'll kill them in one hit. They die. So that's what I mean by like having the one right hit or something like that. Is you just have to figure out how to overcome the tag, right? In a sense, I really, really want combat to feel like a puzzle again. Not just who deals more harm faster than the other, but can you hit the enemies the right way to take them out? I'm getting vibes of getting an attack that gets massive and armored and boom, one hit. Yeah, exactly. Yes. We're on the same page. As usual, BLG, you and I are thinking literally the same thing. So let's put this in a different setting, right? Because that's Dusk, that's sci-fi, right? Let's put this in a fantasy game, because I'm working on Gila Hack, the Thorn edition, and it's gonna have this. Enemies are not gonna have hit points in my fantasy game. I just don't want them to. Which means most goblins just die. If you decide that you want to attack a goblin, it's dead. You don't need to roll to hit, certainly, and you're not going to even determine how much harm you're dealing, because you can just kill a goblin. You're a capable adventurer. In my games, at least, we assume pretty capable characters. Yes, exactly, right? Combining powers or combining hits, right? So maybe there's this big armored foe, and one player has this like rend, like a power or a weapon that rends, which removes the armored tag. So they go up and hit the enemy with their rend weapon, and it just shreds a bunch of the armor off. That lets the next person hit that weak spot that's just been opened up by the rend and kill the enemy and eliminate them. And I think genuinely that this fits and handles 95% of fights. I think 95% of fights you could get away with this sort of stuff, and it really wouldn't feel weird or bad or anything like that. The one thing that you have to keep in mind is bosses. I think that's the one thing where, and you know, people are like, well, what about a boss? Do you want to kill a boss enemy in one? That's a conversation. First of all, does your game have bosses or things that would be considered a boss? And if so, I don't want to give them hit points just for the sake of letting one type of character have hit points, because that would require then attacks and everything to have harm, and we're not going to do that. So how do you do, like, what does a boss look like, right? Why is this not heading over the way I want? There we go. How do you deal with a boss? This is it's gonna be like null. Yes, exactly. The Cheeto has it. It's give specific conditionals to beat down their defensive tags, right? It is mini objectives. Treat them, like a MMO boss, right? You need to get to the damage phase by doing other things first. You need to accomplish a number of tasks that if you do them, the boss is now vulnerable for you to kill them. It also still means it's going to be much faster to kill a boss than most other games, right? You can give them a shit ton of objectives, and that will help. You could be like, yeah, there's 10 mini objectives you got to get through before you can kill the Lich. And yeah, I mean, you could do that if you want. But, you know, again, yes, exactly. It's the 16 hit point dragon thing, but with specific objectives. I wish I had a copy of Null. I don't have it handy right now, but that's what Null is, right? Null is a one-shot Lumen game where you're finding this thing at the end called the Root, and it's very big and powerful, but it has these objectives that if you accomplish them, it makes the boss vulnerable. It either like removes some of its actions or makes it possible for you to kill it. And so that's how you deal with a game. That's how you make bosses in a game that doesn't have hit points. You just have to do these things, and if you don't, you'll never kill the boss. They just don't. They won't die. That shows you that they're a boss, right? That tells me that something is powerful. Something having 130 hit points doesn't tell me it's powerful. It just tells me it's big and annoying. But a boss being like, you must do these 4 things. And if you don't do these 4 things, I'm literally invincible. That tells me we found the big bad. That tells me we found something that we have to think about. That we have to fight in a specific way. That's interesting to me. So, that's what we mean by these things, right? Most enemies die in one hit. Some might require a specific type of hit or a special scenario to have been met, like revealing a stealth enemy. The second it's revealed, you can kill it. The second the armor has been rent, you can kill them. Sometimes it could just simply be 2 hits, right? Like we saw with Dusk, it could just be as simple as it's a massive enemy, or it's an elite enemy, or it's a massive elite enemy. You have to hit it 3 times. How you hit it is totally up to you, but once you've hit it 3 times, it's dead. I think this is cool. I think this is good and cool. I foresee people struggling with this because you either have to give like a very explicit list of tags in both directions, offensive and defensive, and like line them up. So like I use the example, a defensive tag might be armored. And armored can be defeated by Pierce tag or Rend tag, right? Pierce kills armored enemies. Rend removes the armored tag, right? Like you could do that. You could give all the explicit effects of how one tag affects or overrides another tag. Or you can leave it like very much open to interpretation, right? You could, I should just keep it up on the page here, right? Like Arcane just says rituals or runes must be destroyed. Or armored in this case just says a powerful hit. What's a powerful hit? That's up for you all to decide, right? And then as like a table, you get together as like, okay, how can I make this attack that I want to do explicitly powerful? And then the players might work with one another to figure out how they can boost each other up to get that really powerful hit. We're like, okay, I don't think this power I have is powerful enough to overcome armored, but if you knock the armored guy on his butt real quick, maybe he's vulnerable and my thing is powerful enough, right? And then it allows this kind of cool, creative puzzle solving. An enemy that is armored, but that tag is under the tag regeneration, so no one has to have a attack tag of burn. Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, right? So I love that. Regeneration. If you don't have the burn tag, they just keep standing back up, which is like really cool. So you have to find a way to like end them. The thing about this, and let's go back to this for a second here. Why is this good? It emphasizes creativity in combat, puzzle solving, teamwork, right? That's all fun stuff. It's not slow, or at least not slowed by whittling down a big bag of health points. And it encourages build diversity. right? It encourages you as a team to have a bunch of different types of weapons and powers, right? You need people who can do specific things so that when one type of enemy shows up, you're like, thank God we have this guy on our team who's explicitly designed to take care of these enemies, right? Right? You got the demon enemy showing up, and you've got a priestly character who has divine power, or all their attacks are considered divine. And you're like, thank God, literally, that we have the priest to kill these demons. So you then want to have a wide range of characters in the team, but you also then want a wide range of, like, even within your own character, stuff that you have access to. So that you could be like, okay, great, we've got the, I myself have this sort of weapon, which helps me most of the time, but then I can pull out this thing when I need it in specific scenarios. Build diversity within the party and within a PC. What if that guy with that power can't make it to the game that night? Then the GM should be smart enough to not throw those enemies at the party. I mean, if the GM shouldn't punish the party for not having those sorts of things. But I also think in general, then, like, yeah, right? Then, like what Vegito just said, which is like, then the players can look for or ask for explicitly environmental factors or things like that they could be like, great, the guy who normally handles the demons isn't here, but can we do X, Y, or Z to make the demons easier to fight? Great. Or I think this is a great example, right? Take the armored tag of an enemy, throw a wall or a giant boulder at him. Is that normally how you overcome armored? No, but our guy who has the rend weapon isn't here tonight, and we want to fight this armored guy. How can we do it otherwise? You just, I don't know, you work together. Vegito, you're coming in with, like, real good ideas today. I'm loving this. But it is illuminated. Oh, hell yeah, I didn't realize that you were working on a Lumen 2.0 game. Lumen 2.0 game while watching these streams. That's great. I'm glad that you're able to get that. So I like this. Oh, that's awesome. A week or two to get the game out there, or to at least be sharing it. So to kind of come back, wrap this up, right? Or at least wrap up this section here, which is, I think the more interesting thing for me is to have enemies that have no health, but instead pretty much die in one hit, or they require a specific type of hit or a specific tag essentially to be overcome, and then they are made vulnerable. Bosses are just an exaggerated form of that. They have more tags, and or they have, custom-made objectives that you must accomplish in order to really show that it's a boss and that you have to overcome it. I like this quite a bit, and I'm gonna be playing Nova in 2 nights, and it's gonna be the final session in our little mini campaign we're working on, and we're gonna have another fight. And like I said earlier, the fight's gonna resolve with most enemies getting killed in 1 or 2 hits anyway. So, like, I think it would be more interesting for the players is to think about how they're hitting the enemies rather than just how much harm they're dealing with them. And actually, now that I've just said that out loud, how you're hitting your enemies matters. That's literally the entire design philosophy of the approaches in the first place, right? The reason Lumen uses approaches instead of a skill list is because I don't care what you can do. We assume that you can do it. And what's more important is how you are trying to do it. So, just having this experience right now, we are emphasizing how you do an attack rather than a raw amount. this lines up with the design philosophy of objectives, or of approaches. All right. Now, we're going to stop here. I know it was a shorter stream than we normally do, but this is kind of like the big thing that I wanted to talk about. With this down, I think what we can kind of do next is really start to kind of get the through line of what Lumen 2.0 looks like, iron out some of those ideas about, what makes up a character, the gameplay loop, and everything like that. So we'll come back and do all of that during the next design stream. But that's what we'll do for today. I hope you all had a good time watching this. I enjoyed doing this. I appreciate everybody in chat hanging out. And I'll see you next time for the fourth and possible final installment of What is Lumen 2.0. Bye.